The Neural Basis of Consciousness, the Dalai Lama and a Glorious Piece of Meat. An interview with Patricia Churchland, conducted by Meredith Doran, edited by David Christopher Lane, Mount San Antonio College, Walnut, California. A Glorious Piece of Meat. Editor's note. Patricia Smith Churchland is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. She is the author of the book Neurophilosophy, Toward a Unified Science of Mind-Brain, Cambridge, MIT Press, 1986, which outlines her views on the connection between philosophy and neuroscience. The following interview was conducted by Meredith Doran, editor of Plato's Cave, on March 10, 1990. David Christopher Lane, professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and founder of the MSAC Philosophy Group, edited Miss Doran's transcript and has included an addendum and a suggested reading list. Meredith Doran. What I would like to ask you first is, what initially led you into being interested in philosophy, or was it science that first interested you? Patricia Churchland. What drew me into philosophy? Well, I just got very interested as an undergraduate in the kinds of questions that were raised in a philosophical context, but I was at the same time very interested in science, especially biology. So, what led you into working in philosophy rather than in scientific research? I don't know that there was anything really interesting in regards to choosing philosophy over science, but I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy, and I went first to the University of Pittsburgh. I did an MA there, and I probably should have stayed to do the PhD there, but I had sort of itchy feet, and I was interested in going abroad for a while. So I went to England, to Oxford, and I finished up there. And so at this point, were you keeping up with the neuroscience research that was going on? No, not particularly I wasn't. I was really doing very traditional philosophy at the time. What were your beliefs? What was your position at that time? Any different from now? Well, I guess as a graduate student, especially at Oxford, I came to really be very dissatisfied with the sorts of methods that people were using to try to answer questions within philosophy. They were interested in questions about the nature of rationality, the nature of perception, about the nature of knowledge and how we could know things, and the view seemed to be that if we wanted to understand these things, then what we should do is to sort of reflect long and deep on these issues and to analyze the concepts as people use them within ordinary language. That's the big thing that was done at that time, and it seemed to me to be likely to be non-productive. It seemed to me to be not very rewarding as a method. Kind of a vaguely defined way of approaching these issues. Yes, perhaps reflection is an important element, but that, unless one takes into account the data that really are available about, say, the nature of rationality or the nature of perception, that you're likely to be missing quite a lot. Now, that opinion was not well received at Oxford. At that time, I think that people thought it was just a bit naive. I nevertheless wrote my thesis along those lines. Donald Davidson, I think, was very important in the sense that he had taken the view that we should see desires and beliefs and so forth as causes within the whole scheme of things, rather than rational ideals or something. And once you do that, and once you think along the lines that Quine does, then it seems quite obvious that what you want to do is look for an empirical or scientific account of how humans work. And you began to try out a more science-based approach to philosophy. How did you address the issue of what differentiates us from the things around us? How are we, as humans, different from inanimate objects? Is there anything that makes us uniquely human? Well, obviously there is something that is different between inanimate and animate things, and we know what it is. It's DNA. Or if you're a virus, it's RNA. And that's pretty clear. I mean, people used to think that what differentiated such things was vital spirit or the life force or élan vital or something of that nature. So, if anything survives us, is that it? Our DNA, our genetic patterning? Well, if you have children it does, but unless you have a clone of you, if you had a clone of you, then of course the same DNA would be there. But obviously if you do the standard method, which is sexual reproduction, then you're getting a genetic mix. Your children aren't you, but they are related to you in a really close way, obviously. But that's all. People have had the thought that there is something special about humans and that after we die there is a soul and it goes to heaven or to paradise. And in that and wrong will be righted and you'll meet old friends again and so forth. And that does not look plausible at all. It looks like fantasy. It's what people might wish to be the case, but it's not evidently something that is the case. So my feeling is that when the body dies and when the brain dies, that's it. There isn't anything else to hang around. So, what would you say differentiates us from lower species? Is it that we simply have more complicated neural networks? Well, our brain is a little different from other brains, but the monkey brain is different from the chimpanzee brain too. So every species has a brain that's a little bit different from the brain that anyone else has. Higher and lower doesn't always enter into it. Do you believe that humans have a more complicated system of levels of consciousness than other species? Well, they might have. I don't know. We don't really know. It does seem to be the case that our language system is unique, but on the other hand, there are some things that monkeys can do that we can't do. Swing through the trees, for example, or hang upside down from their tails, if they have tails, and so forth. And there are a lot of things that a beaver can do that I can't do. I can't build a dam the way a beaver can build a dam, and not just because I don't have the big front teeth to chew things down, but because they have the knowledge and the skill of how to put a dam together. So I don't think that higher and lower is necessarily a useful way to think of it. People have this inclination to think that there is this great chain of being, and hot dog, we're on top of it, or that we're fashioned in the image of God. It's silly. We are evolutionarily somewhere along the line, and what would be nice to know would be what it is about our brains that enables us to have a culture and that enables us to do such things as use language. But that's not something that's necessarily more valuable than being able to do what a gorilla does or what an orangutan does. In light of all the scientific and technological advances that have come about in the past few hundred years, do you feel that dualism is even a tenable position in the modern world? No, not at all. It's not. It's just barely conceivable and very implausible. So, do you believe that as our scientific knowledge increases, a scientific mindset will eventually take over, superseding mythical ways of viewing and explaining the world around us? Well, it's hard to say what will happen. That's a sort of sociological prediction that you're asking me to make. I think it's very hard to say because people are very inclined to hold fast to lots of old superstitious beliefs. There are still some people that are being treated for mental illness by having a priest come in to exorcise the devil. So, whether or not people will come to think, well, gee, we understand this, that, and the other thing about the brain, so that's why we understand that certain people are intolerant, and that's why certain other people are violent, and why certain other people have this or that kind of character. We may be able to do that, but it may well be that the bulk of uneducated people or semi-educated people go on thinking about things in their very traditional ways. Well, how would you assess the evolutionary development of neuroscience as a field? Is it a fully established discipline, or does it have a long way to go? How fast do you think that neuroscience research is moving? Well, again, that's very hard to say. It has to be remembered that you can't study the brain very easily without really high-powered, advanced technology and equipment. And, of course, that's why it was much easier to do cosmology if you were Galileo than it was to do neuroscience. He didn't have a microscope. He didn't have ways of fixing tissue to prevent it from rotting. He didn't have ways of staining neurons, and since there was no electricity, he didn't have ways of recording from cells, and so on. So it's really only within this century, and probably really, given the new techniques, only within the last 2 or 3 decades, that progress has really been spectacular. And it's just very hard to say what will happen in the future. In your book, Neurophilosophy, you attempt to integrate neuroscience and philosophy. Why? Are there questions that can't be answered by science alone? Well, I think that science in its broadest sense means the critical investigation and formulation of hypotheses. That's just a very, very broad description, but the critical part is important because it means that science must always be prepared to revise in the light of new data. It means that data is relevant to hypotheses. It means that hypotheses should be testable and should be testable again and again and again. And the trouble with many of the ideas that people have about knowledge beyond science is that they're just goofy. They're ideas that somehow special knowledge will be revealed to special people, but that those of us who don't have it can't criticize it, can't test it, can't explore it, can't investigate it. Typically, what we've seen in the past is that sort of stuff has just been chicanery. It's been charlatanism. Or it has come from people who are not necessarily trying to deceive others, but who are actually self-deceived. I mean, perhaps they're schizophrenic, for example, and they actually imagine when they hear voices that it is God talking to them. Well, it's not. What makes you believe that the work that's currently being done in neuroscience is not just another misled effort? Well, because we test and we retest, and it's open to anybody. Any hypothesis is open to criticism. And because if I'm not sure about what somebody says, I can go and say, show me. And if they say, well, this doesn't manifest itself when people like you are around, when skeptics are around, then we say, yes, okay, we can scotch that. Science is open. Science is critical. Science reviews and revises itself, and that's what makes science science. That's what the scientific method is really all about, and that's what differentiates it from superstition, where people believe things regardless of the data. And that's what differentiates it from religion, where people believe regardless of what the evidence is and regardless of what the criticisms might be. And where is the place of philosophy in terms of science? Well, I think that philosophy is continuous with science, and I think that it always has been. I think that it was certainly true of Aristotle when he was reflecting on the nature of motion and substance, and I see it that way now. What happens, of course, in the history of the subject is that as theories develop and as hypotheses become confirmed, they sort of hive off the mother body. They hive off of philosophy and they become a specialized discipline like chemistry or physics or cosmology or what have you. And until very recently, philosophy of mind, that is, issues concerning the nature of the mind, was still very much part of philosophy because techniques in both psychology and neuropsychology got to the point where we knew enough to have specialized disciplines in the nature of the mind. But now I think that's happening. So I see philosophy as playing a sort of synoptic role here, as taking a kind of broad view of trying to synthesize ideas, sometimes across disciplines, and to generate very general hypotheses about what's going on. But I don't see it as in some sense independent of science or special from science, or that it has a special access to a special kind of knowledge or anything of that sort. But I realize that most philosophers would disagree with me. You've indicated a belief that advances in neuroscientific research and technology will lead to changes in ethical considerations in terms of philosophy. Well, it's hard to know. I think that there are likely to be ethical implications of advancing knowledge in neuroscience, just as there are ethical implications of advancing knowledge in anything. We always have to decide what to do as we understand things a little deeper, and, in this case, I think that it may be that we will understand certain aspects of ourselves and to what degree we have freedom of the will, or we have free choice, or what effects on character early kinds of childhood experiences have, why some people are more tolerant than others, how to achieve tolerance, how to achieve understanding, and so forth. What kind of ethics do you think that materialists can legitimately have according to what they know to be true? I think in some ways we are very Aristotelian and in some ways use utilitarian principles. I think that we try to reason and understand to the best that we can what it is that a good person or a right person would do in such and such a situation and what would be fair, and we try to reflect on what fairness consists in and try not to be dogmatic, try to be tolerant, try to be as fair-minded as possible. I think that really, in some ways, tolerance is something which is critically important to the survival of the species, that it's something that's very often neglected when people teach their children morals. They think it's important to be intolerant of people who are different, intolerant of people who are pro-choice, intolerant of people who want to live a different style of life, intolerant of certain kinds of sexual practices, and so on. I think that that's very worrisome, and I don't think that the human race can tolerate that. The human race cannot tolerate intolerance, in other words. So, perhaps if we knew more about how the brain works, then we might be able to achieve a greater degree of tolerance and understanding of one another. And I would think that that would be for the benefit of mankind. In addressing the areas of morals, intolerance, and intolerance, we come to the issue of religion. Some say that religions have, in the search for truth, actually put up barriers to finding the truth. Do you think this is true? Do you think that religious or spiritual ways of approaching the search for truth can be valid, can provide any useful or helpful information? It depends on what you're talking about. I don't think that religion is of the slightest help in the search for empirical truth or for truth about the nature of things. And indeed, the history of religion has shown that by and large, religions are anti-intellectual. They're anti-scientific. They actually prevent progress rather than aid it. So, I don't think they're of the least help so far as understanding the nature of ourselves and understanding the nature of the universe is concerned. But I think that there might be wise people who happen to be in religions, or who happen not to be in religions, who can be helpful to us about how to live a life, as I think Aristotle was, for example. Have there been any religions, such as Buddhism, for example, which steers away from dogmatism that have interested you or intrigued you? Well, not me personally, because that isn't something that I feel I need, but when I did begin to learn something about Buddhism in the context of having this tutorial with the Dalai Lama, I think I did begin to appreciate that if people have to have a religion, then probably Buddhism is amongst the better ones to have, because of its emphasis on tolerance, on self-reliance, on reasoning things out yourself, keeping dogma to an absolute minimum, because there is an attempt to achieve a kind of wisdom through experience and through living and through talking to people who are supposed to know more than you and who are supposed to be wise in the way to live life. And I think that they are very helpful to many people in the question not of the nature of truth, but in the questions about how to live a life. Should I make this kind of choice or that kind of choice? Should I try to be this sort of person or that sort of person? And there, I think that they are helpful. But I think that within any religion, there are probably people who are somewhat helpful. But there are as many people who are not. There are lots of priests and lots of ministers who are positively not helpful about how to live a life because they themselves are misdirected in one way or another. Which is no surprise. I mean, why would they be expected to know a lot about how to live a life just because they're a priest? So, just by the principle of random chance, you're going to find some religious people who are wise? Yes. And some people really are. They grow up perhaps in a loving atmosphere or whatever. But I think that some people are really good at it. And some of them go into clinical psychology. Some of them end up teaching mathematics at school. It depends. I know you have worked with the Dalai Lama. I'm wondering if, in spending time with him, you got any idea of what it is about him that makes people think he is spiritually enlightened. What are people responding to? Well, I don't think he is enlightened particularly, because I don't think that anybody is, except that I think that he's learned a lot in his life. I think he's acquired quite a lot of knowledge about the way the world is. I think that what is nice about him, one reason why one responds to him, is that first of all, he is very, very tolerant, and he listens. If he wants to know something, he'll ask a question, and then he'll listen to the answer, and he may change his mind depending on what you said. I think that for someone in his position, well, one doesn't always see that. If I may draw a contrast with the Pope, I think that there we see somebody who probably is less open than the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama is also very gentle, very unpretentious, and one senses that this is what he thinks is important in life. When he says, for example, "I'm just a simple monk," the first time you hear it you think, oh, well, that's like the Pope saying, "I'm just a simple priest." But as it turns out, he has a kind of unpretentiousness and a kind of directness and a kind of honesty that does make him special. But he's not the only person I've met who's like that. I mean, I have met scientists who were like that, but it makes them very lovable people, and certainly I thought that he, the Dalai Lama, was very kind and very gentle, a very good person. Getting back to your own work, neuroscience and the nature of existence, do you think that science, even if it is able to map out mental processes in terms of brain physiology, can even begin to address the ultimate origin of those processes? Where, in your opinion, is the cause or origin of mental processes? I do think that neuroscience will be able to explain, well, it depends on what mental processes you're talking about, but I think that if you're talking about, for example, the nature of memory or perception or reasoning or use of language, I have no doubt that we will understand those processes in terms of the way the circuits in the brain function. I mean, there isn't anything else to explain them in terms of, so it's better be that. There's no spooky stuff lying around such that when I look in a certain direction I see an orange. It's the way the rods and cones work, and the neurons work, and the way the circuits are put together that allows me to see that orange. Now, there's still a lot that we don't understand about it, but I expect that we will understand it. Now, of course, it might turn out, for some weird reason, that we won't, but I can't see that we won't. So I think we just have to keep working at it, and I think we'll get those answers, and I think it'll be very exciting, because we'll be able to understand ourselves, why we have the thoughts and feelings we have, why we're conscious, why we're aware, and we'll know that it's thus and such circuit doing thus and such thing. Now, some people find that rather threatening, and they think, I want to be a mystery, I don't want to be explained, I don't want to be just stuff. But of course, what one wants, well, first of all, you have to ask why one would want that. Why would it be better to be a mystery to yourself than to understand yourself? And then if it turns out that you just are stuff, that your brain just is meat, then wanting it to be different isn't going to change it. Why not accept it for the glorious piece of meat that it is? And what are your hopes in neuroscience? What kind of changes or improvements do you think we might be able to make by understanding more about learning processes, memory, etc.? It's hard to say, but I would hope that we might be able to understand the basis of Alzheimer's, so that that could be prevented, perhaps not cured, but at least prevented. And there are many other diseases as well. I would hope that we would understand more about the nature of schizophrenia, of manic depression, of the classical psychiatric syndromes. and to better understand addiction. I think that tremendous progress has been made at the cellular level in understanding addiction, and so much so that one can even envisage a kind of vaccination against alcoholism, for example. Those sorts of things would make a tremendous difference to the quality of life that we have. I sense then a great deal of hopefulness on your part. Yes, I think so. I think it's a tremendously exciting and tremendously hopeful thing. But first of all, as I said, because of all the many, many diseases, MS is another one where I think tremendous progress has been made, and I think we may be quite close to understanding the basis of MS, then I think we may be able to prevent it. And so on, for all the zillions of diseases that there are. I mean, it might be a lot better if people could just age gracefully rather than start losing their neurons and becoming demented by the time they're 65. You know, I would much rather be sort of bright and chipper and then all of a sudden dead than go downhill in the way that many people who have Alzheimer's do. It's a terrible, terrible thing to see. And where is your own work headed? What are you currently focusing on at this point? I'm working on a book on computational neuroscience, which has to do with the nature of computational hypotheses at the level of the circuit. We know quite a bit about what's happening at the level of the single cell, but we want to know how single cells interact with one another in order to produce an effect such as remembering something or such as recognizing something as an orange. And so the book is directed to some technical as well as some very general questions at that level. Neural Reflections, David Christopher Lane. If we are more than the physical substratum of our cerebral cortex, why is it that everything we do is modulated by our brain? I go to sleep because of chemical electrical signals triggered within my skull. I wake up for the same reason. Yet, because my awareness seems distinct from my bodily apparatus, I somehow believe that I am running the show. However, the reality is that I can do very little. I don't digest my food. I don't beat my heart. I don't develop antibodies to ward off diseases. I don't even know if I originate thoughts or only direct them. The I does very little indeed, except believe itself to be more than what it actually is, an epiphenomenon of networking neurons. So far so good, but there's one glitch here. Consciousness talks about neurons. Neurons don't talk about consciousness. Everything we have known in the world must come through the medium of consciousness, even the idea of neuroscience, even the idea of philosophy, even the idea of materialism must arise through the medium of self-reflective awareness. It is, in fact, the medium of consciousness, non-reducible in terms of actual lived-through experience, which contextualizes everything we can ever know about the universe. What comes first, neurons or awareness? If you say the former, how do you know unless you are already aware? If you say the latter, why is it that when someone clubs you over the head with a bat, your awareness of this world ceases? The fact remains that whatever is the source of our I awareness, it does not alter our existential dilemmas. We are still stuck to living in a world which seems to transcend its neural origins. The following seems to summarize the mind-brain debate, at least from a materialist perspective. Indeed, we know we are more than just neurons firing, or at least we think we are while the neurons are firing. Recommended readings. 1. Churchland, Paul, Matter and Consciousness, MIT Press. 2. Churchland, Patricia, Neurophilosophy, MIT Press. 3. Dennett, Daniel, Consciousness Explained, Little, Brown and Company. 4. McGinn, Colin, The Problem of Consciousness, Basil Blackwell. 5. Searle, John, The Rediscovery of the Mind, MIT Press. The Multi-Level View of Consciousness, David Christopher Lane. It seems to me that we often get caught up in a tripartite dilemma, one which is echoed in the following intellectual triangle: pretext, text, and context, or prehension, apprehension, comprehension, or deflation, elation, inflation, or reductionism, phenomenology, complexity. Take a book, actually any book, but in this example we will simply limit it to that wonderful little text published by Cambridge University Press, What is Life by Erwin Schrödinger. Not very long, my edition is only 96 pages, but sufficient to get the point across. Now, if I wanted to apprehend its contents, I would read the entire tome. So far, so good. But let's say that I wanted to discover what ultimately constituted the book. That is, I wanted to know what the common underlying symbol system was that actually comprised the text. In this type of quest, the pun is intentional, I would reduce the book down to its chapter divisions down to pages, pages down to paragraphs, paragraphs down to sentences, sentences down to words, and finally, words down to letters. Letters, individual, but only 26 variations in our alphabet, symbols, would be the fundamental unit by which information is encoded. But let us imagine that I only read What is Life in terms of its letters, not the words they form, or the sentences they create, or the paragraphs they construct, or the pages they comprise. What then? Would I understand the meaning of the book if I simply limited my reading to the symbol units themselves? The answer is fairly obvious. No. Why? Because the letters, A or B or Z, do not, indeed cannot, convey the meaning as isolated units. They begin to form meaning when they conjoin and develop a larger complex, a larger construction. Okay, so now we understand something called pretext. That unit which is rudimentary to the book, but which is not yet readable as a text. Important sidebar. As the latest studies in reading have shown, Hooked on Phonics, Michael Landon's greatest legacy, or the understanding of the sounds that constitute words is very helpful to students for later reading and comprehension. Indeed, as good as holistic reading may be, phonics is even more helpful at a fundamental level. The reason why is pretty obvious. The more one grounds herself in pre-text, the more secure the information will be when one moves up to textual understanding. Why? Because there will be less confusion of word or sentence formation. Pretext is fundamental. But now let us imagine that we have understood pretext, symbols or the alphabet in our example, and text, the larger complex which words and sentences and paragraphs develop. Is that all that is necessary to comprehend? I'm consciously using a different word than apprehend at this stage. Schrödinger's book, What is Life? Well, yes and no. Yes, because clearly I can get a fairly decent sense of what our quantum theorist is trying to convey. No, because there are certain things around or beyond the text which the book cannot convey, but which, strangely enough, is demanded for better comprehension. That missing something is not pretext or text, but context. Context can range from the very simple, the paper quality, the binding, the typography, the smell of the book. Anyone who has read books published in India will immediately know what I am talking about, to the very complex, What year was the book published? What prior knowledge of math, of physics, of astronomy, of biology is necessary to better engage the text? Moreover, what is my mood? What country am I in? What religious, scientific beliefs do I bring to the text? Is it night time? Is the TV on? Silly questions? Not really, since this larger infusing environment, ranging from the rudimentary to the baneful to the sophisticated, plays an important factor in any reading of any book at any time. Context is the larger arena by which any text, formed by any pretext, is understood. Pretext, rudimentary, fundamental. Text, instrumental, informative. Context, bounding, eliciting, forming. And, as such, a pretext can evolve itself into a text, which in turn evolves itself into a context, so that a context in a different situation can become the pretext to a new text, which itself is housed by a new context, and so on and so on. Or as Ken Wilber would have it, holons, holons, and more holons. Each holon, as Wilber would suggest, comprised of holonic parts, but which itself acts a holonic part. I know it sounds oxymoronic, but that's the point of some larger holon. Atoms have parts, electrons and protons, for instance, but an atom is part of something larger, molecules. Molecules have parts, atoms of varying weights, but a molecule is part of something larger, cells. Cells have parts, molecular bonding, but a cell is part of something larger, a simple organism, etc. Which leads to brains have parts, neurons, axons, synapses. But a brain is part of something larger, the human body. The human body has parts, the brain, the heart, the liver, but the human body is part of something larger, family, environment, and so on. Okay, so who cares? Well, it seems as if we are always struggling with this dilemma, reduce or inflate, pretext or context. What Wilber suggests, though I don't think he is aware of how thoroughly materialistic his system can be, is that science tends toward reductionism, toward Occam's razor, toward Churchland's inter-theoretic explanations. And that is its great strength. It tends to explain things more simply, and by more simply we mean more fundamentally. For this reason, it usually kicks butt on any or all inflated theories, context which seems divorced from pretext. But reductionism can in fact go too far, and what I mean by too far is that it can actually become anti-informational when such reductionism, to echo the words of Dennett, becomes cheap. What is cheap reductionism? Let's go back to our book, What is Life? Remember that we can reduce the text to a series of letters, and such reductionism would be very helpful at first. Indeed, it would give us a tremendous grasp of what we could or perhaps could not do with such a symbol system. But let's imagine that I wanted to reduce even further. I find that the letters are made of little lines, so that a W looks like two V's, VV, conjoined. We can even go farther and see that all letters in print are made of tiny molecules which are themselves made up of atoms, and the atoms are eventually made of quarks. And quarks? Well, superstrings in nth dimension are vibrating at a frequency below Planck's constant, which is not at any perceptive level. See, we have gone too far. It is nice to say that words are nothing more than the congealed results of trapped electrons, but it adds very little in terms of instrumental or pivotal information. To be sure, it helps to understand other things about our universe, But given the complexity of letters, it does not add to our present domain-related discussion. We have made a classic boundary skip, category collapse, and we have indulged in cheap, not very worthwhile, reductionism. Yet, this does not mean that reductionism is bad. It just means that reductionism is quite useful in the right domain. Reduce too much, and we lose. Don't reduce, and we inflate too much. Having said all this, it is obvious that the direction of science must always be fundamentally in the path of reducing as far as it can go while remaining useful and informational. Let us see how this works across disciplines. Physics looks to math, perhaps our most precise and accurate human language. Chemistry looks to physics, especially quantum mechanics. Just see the work of Linus Pauling. Biology, especially molecular biology, looks to chemistry. Just think of Watson and Crick and the double helix model of DNA. Psychology looks, or perhaps they should, to neuroscience, the study of the brain. Why? Because the greatest progress in psychology has not come from Freud or Jung. It has come from those pioneers who have grounded their studies in evolutionary brain science. Just think to yourself when you get a headache, should I call 1-900 shaman, or should I take an Excedrin extra-strength tablet? A sociology grounded in evolutionary theory may actually come up with some revolutionary and cross-cultural predictions. Get rid of Marx, but not his reductionist spirit, and hitch it to evolution, and sociology may go somewhere. Now, each of these disciplines succeeds when they discover their basic alphabet, their basic pretext. That has to be done and is the key to any further scientific progress. Below is a very simplistic look at various pretext alphabets. Physics. At the subatomic level, it is clearly quantum mechanics and its sophisticated reworking, QED, which is so amazingly precise that no theory rivals it in terms of accuracy. Molecular biology. DNA, as everyone knows, is the blueprint for all life. Evolutionary biology. Natural selection. Darwin's contribution, as Dennett so rightly points out, is probably the single greatest thought given to man. But let's go back to what is life. Can I get a QED reading of it? Can I get a DNA reading of it? Can I get a natural selection reading of it? Yeah, but it is not going to be as useful or as informative as understanding the English language at its own level. So let's jump domains and cut to the chase. Metaphors coming, literalists beware. 1. The brain is a text. 2. Neurons are its subtext. 3. The human body, thanks to Descartes' error for informing us here, is the context. Now, I want to understand me. Best to start with the brain's alphabet, Neuroscience 101, then look at the brain's architecture and how the neural symphony comes together, and then look at the larger human anatomy and see how all the various beyond-brain parts work together. Is that enough? No, because just as neurons have constituent parts, so does the human body have a much larger context or field of interplay. That larger context or infusing environment always arises when the pretext and text have reached their terminus, their limit. Thus, if we want to avoid cheap reductionism, we also want to avoid expensive inflationism. Think of fake or monopoly money. Why did I go on at length about pretext, text, context, alphabets, books, purviews? Because in trying to understand consciousness, soul, we usually run in two directions. Deflation. Hey, Crick's right, I am nothing more than a sophisticated neural net. Or inflation. Hey, Wilbur's right, I am pure spirit. In the middle of such opposing sides is relation, the connection between these two views, such as, hey, all I know is that I feel more than the body, except in those cases when I have a really bad headache or toothache. What is fairly obvious in understanding a book? Pretext, alphabet, phonics, text, words, sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and context. When was this book written? Where was it published? What mood am I in when I read it? Can also be applied via analogy, literalists beware, to consciousness. Pretext, brain, neural net, connectionist, PDP, text, I consciousness, personality, the lived-through sense of me. Context, in what city does this I live? What relationship do I have to my family, to my nation, to my religion, etc.? Given this simple scenario, it becomes obvious that we can reduce consciousness down to its pretext, the brain, and we would be only partially correct. We would not, perhaps could not, understand the qualia, the phenomenology of my own lived-through experiences, John Searle's first person, if we merely stayed at the level of neurons. No doubt we would understand a tremendous amount, and my biases lean, I should point out, with the Churchlands for intertheoretic reductions whenever possible. But something would be lost in the reductive translation. We need text. Read the personality at its own level, at its own understanding, at its own self-reflections. Moreover, there is something about consciousness that is not merely the brain, but also the body entity, as Descartes' error strongly suggests. Additionally, consciousness as such arises within a larger field, that of family relations, societal relations, ecological niches, etc. It is this larger field which informs and shapes much of what we know about our consciousness and personality. This larger context is essential, especially when one considers the vast differences in cultures throughout time and place on this planet. The above tripartite schema is clear enough, and I would venture to guess that most would not disagree with it. Where we run into difficulty is when we start to think of consciousness as transcending physicality. Well, to be sure, there is a transcendence of sorts when the alphabet turns into words and words into sentences and so on, but it is not divorced from the prior structure. Indeed, each higher level is situated upon, sits upon, that former and undergirding pretext. Okay, The Great Gatsby transcends a mere random collection of letters. There is a point, there is meaning, there is character development. But take out those very letters at any stage and the entire superstructure of the novel collapses. As Wilbur would point out, or any good physicist for that matter, the alphabet is more fundamental than sentences, though sentences are more significant, convey more meaning, have more depth. So, at each stage of explanation, we are confronted with this situation. What is the pretext? Alphabet, the rudimentary symbols by which we comprise larger sets. Hint, this can be applied to anything. Atoms, electrons, nucleus, molecules, living cells, DNA, and so on. What is the text? This is actually quite arbitrary, and it depends where and when we want to measure something, but once staked out, it becomes the rallying point for pretext and context. What is the context? In what larger field does the alphabet, the DNA, the atoms, the quarks, etc., arise? But here's the catch. None of these larger texts or contexts is divorced or separated from its predecessors. Indeed, in terms of genealogy, it is impossible to have a book as such without a rudimentary symbol system. It is impossible to have molecules without atoms. It is impossible to have a brain without neurons. A note of caution to my AI friends, this is merely an analogy. I am not denying that silicon chips could not in theory replace neural components. Even then, there is still a pretext: sand. Thus, when one speaks of consciousness without a brain, or beyond the body, or without physicality, it is naturally criticized by those conversant with neurology. They don't buy it, since they know that by understanding the pretext of the brain, they can actually change how the brain functions. They know the code, and there is nothing to suggest that consciousness which arises in the brain can somehow fly away from the body or code without any restraint whatsoever. But this is exactly the point about any physical or mental or spiritual thing. Things arise from other things, and those very things arise in fields of emergence. Yet there is no absolute separation from the quantity of one thing into the quantity of another or new thing. To put it to consciousness, we have the following: neurons, subset brain, set personality, post-set or personality, preset society, set ecology, environment, post-set all the way down, as Wilber says, holons all the way up. Yet, Wilber makes one huge sky hook mistake. Thanks, Daniel Dennett, when he argues that spirit is the basis of all matter. Wilber wants us to believe that spirit is not based upon matter, but the reverse. This is where he makes his leap, and where any materialist worth his salt is going to have huge difficulties with Wilber. What Wilber should concede, he doesn't, is that he does not know what spirit is. I don't either. Why? Because what Wilber really means by spirit is the context of every pretext, text, context. That is, the infinity in which everything arises. Well, I don't know what that is. Wilber does not know what that is. I would imagine nobody knows what that is. What we do know, partially, are limited frames of reference, and as such we can pontificate upon them, from quarks to atoms to molecules to cells to people to societies to nations. But let's not go too far. There may be an astral plane, but we have no evidence at this stage to comprehend it. We only have limited symbols which may point to it. Yet, do we admit to this contextual impasse? Do we in fact say with humility, there might be? Yes and no. When one reads Wilber or anybody, including almost all of my early writings, you get the impression that he, she, it has a lock on the ultimate truth. Whoa, we just found out about DNA structure, and that only explains the alphabet of life processes. Before the 1950s, we didn't know. So, can we then take a huge leap from DNA to the fabulous inner regions of Sahanstal Kanwal? We can, but my hunch is that we are merely infusing contexts that we do not as of yet know exist, and by doing such we confuse ourselves unnecessarily. Dennett would say we are going for sky hooks, not cranes, but it is cranes all the way up that produce the higher orders, the complex systems, not the other way around. What meditation may indicate is a higher context, but that very higher context will, by necessity, be grounded in the text that precedes it. What is that? The brain. Hence, there is no way around this from a bottom-up perspective, but to admit that everything is higher-order materialism. I could say spirit, but that would incline itself to meaningless gibberish. When I say matter is all there is, it tends toward reductionism and thus is more locatable in terms of its pretexts. It does not mean, of course, that I know what matter ultimately is. I don't. What it suggests is that we ground our speculations, as always, with the rudimentary tools that are available. Wilbur and others with a consciousness bent, read big context takes over all, will heartily disagree with my slant, thinking that I have sold my soul in exchange for quantum mechanics and neurology and evolution. No. I have come to grips with the fact that whatever my soul may be is grounded in the pretexts, texts, contexts of everything that arises within my body and without it. Thus, I think we will understand a lot more of what we mean by soul if we start with what we mean by body, by brain, etc. Now, if there is indeed a context which transcends this frame of reference, this waking state, then having a humble approach to it, I would argue, will be even better. We will be more open and skeptical. Open to the possibility, skeptical of misguided confusions of pretext and context. What we get instead with Wilberian-type thinking is actually a bit of hubris and a whole lot of arrogance. Well, he is on the 7th plane, she is on the 8th plane, and Free Willy is stuck in the bowels of the astral. Think for a second. How many times have we engaged in arguments over inner-level attainments from the comfort of our own chairs? And all the while, most of us cannot even explain, in terms of physiology, how we grow hair on our arms. I find it completely amazing that we cannot define this universe, which is the emerging context by which we can empirically understand our lives. But geez, we most definitely know the ins and outs of the astral plane and who resides there. Materialism is multi-dimensional. The reason it is probably nicer to use that term versus spirit is that it tends toward reductionism. It tends towards looking to its primary alphabet. By positing a materialist position, we look first for the cranes. By positing a spiritualist position, we look first for the skyhooks. Or in the terminology I have been using, by saying matter first, we look for pretext. By saying spirit first, we look for supercontext, usually divorced from any empirical referent. Now, it is correct to look for both pretext and context, but both arise in a relationship in the here and now. Supercontexts, or spirit, is usually too far up the hierarchy to mean anything useful. I could say anything to posit a supercontext. Elvis, Sugmad, Anami Purush, God, Jesus, Gumby, etc. But it would, given our grounded lives here, mean zip. Why zip? Because it can stand for anything. Yet matter is the same thing, one might counter. Yes, but it has one advantage. It looks to its predecessors, to its genealogical parents, to its alphabet, to its cranes, to its roots. And when such is lacking, then, and only then, can it make the slow climb up. Spirit, we could actually say infinity instead, is never definable because it is by definition never ascertainable or limited. Matter is about limits, or at the least our understanding of how energy, matter, interacts at a certain level. Our text. But matter is not something flat, not something grey. It is absolutely beyond my fullest comprehension. And yet, as Einstein rightly said, he was agnostic and a materialist. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Thus we may not ultimately know, but we know a little, and that little grows by looking to its roots. Postscript. A very strange incident occurred in 1990 after we published Meredith Doran's interview with Professor Patricia Churchland. I was attending the year-end commencement ceremonies at Mount San Antonio College when a newly hired professor walked up to me and my colleagues and asked about the latest issue of Plato's Cave, which contained the Churchland interview. "Professor Lane, are you the one responsible for publishing Plato's Cave?" "Yes. Did you get a chance to read it?" Yeah, and it should never have been printed. It is humanist crap." Right then, this academic then took his copy of Plato's Cave, which he had in his hand, and then proceeded to tear it up and throw it on the ground at my feet. I was wonderstruck. He then, in a fit of rage, walked away. That was 30 years ago, and I have never talked to him since. At the time, I couldn't understand what upset him so much. Was it Churchland's infamous line that we are just 3 pounds of glorious meat? Or was it that consciousness can be explained by studying the brain? But it became clearer a few minutes later when my mathematician friend, who witnessed the affair, explained that the disgruntled professor was a fundamentalist Christian who believed in the inerrancy of the Bible. Oh, I see. But doesn't he realize that higher education is about tolerating differences of opinion? My mathematician friend just shook his head and said insightfully, "When it comes to religion, logic and reason make a swift exit." This has been The Neural Basis of Consciousness, the Dalai Lama and a Glorious Piece of Meat. An interview with Professor Patricia Churchland, written by David Christopher Lane, narrated by Jason Zenobia. Copyright 2019 by David Christopher Lane. Production copyright by David Christopher Lane.